Welcome everyone. My name is Jenny Phelan and I'm the Programme Manager for Adult Learning here at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you all. This talk tonight is one of a series we've been running with Rosie Goldsmith entitled Fashion and Fiction, which is a bit self-explanatory. Rosie interviews very well-known writers and talks to them about their love of clothes and some of the ways in which clothes and dress have inspired both their writing and their own lives. Tonight we are very delighted to welcome Joanna Trollope, OBE. Joanna is the author of 18 highly acclaimed best-selling novels, including A Village Affair and The Rector's Wife, and more recently, Balancing Act and her reworking of Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. This book, amongst others, are on sale outside of the lecture theatre this evening. So if you are interested, please do take a look once the conversation is finished, because Joanna has very kindly agreed to do a book signing which will take place just behind me on the stage.
Welcome everyone. Lovely to see you all. I'm sure and hope there'll be a few people who've been before to these events. If you think of it, clothing and costume have been integral to narrative and character across cultures and across the centuries. And if you just think of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, Scott Fitzgerald's Gatsby, and in our own time, Wolf Hall, Hilary Mantel, and so on. Every single book you'll find, even if it's by exclusion, you'll see that the importance of costume and the detail of dress or not. Now, fashion and fiction is, for me, it's the great unexplored treasure trove, or, if you like, sort of dressing up box of literature until now, until we started this series. And the series began exactly a year ago, this week, here at the V&A, which is, of course, a marriage made in heaven to have a series like this here at the V&A, with Margaret Atwood. And she was talking about her personal passion for clothes and the integral part they play in her novels. And then we had Linda Grant and Yung Chang. And if you weren't able to attend the events, as Jenny said, you'll be able to see them on the website. Now, I call all these writers very collectively my fashion and fictionistas, and tonight we have two star guests as a special treat for International Women's Day. I'm sure you all know. Two of my favourite women writers together in one event, Jane Austen and Joanna Trollope. Now, two best-selling novelists whose witty works of romantic fiction have earned them both places as two of the most widely read writers in English literature. Both so English, so prolific and popular, televised, adapted and satirised. Their clear-sighted and sympathetic insight into family life and relationships, the unfussy approach to life, however complex, and their craft as writers, their wonderful lively dialogue and characterizations and social realism makes them both, as the wonderful Henry James, who so loved Jane Austen, said, among the fine painters of life. So the ultimate tribute of Joanna to Jane is Joanna's modern-day retelling of Sense and Sensibility. We have a lot to talk about. Welcome, Joanna Trollope. So, Joanna, how well do you know Jane Austen?
Well, I grew up on her in a way that I think often the modern young can't grow up on her quite the same way, because nobody ever asked me whether I was going to find it difficult to read Georgian English. And of course, there is a huge raft of young women, particularly now, who think they are ardent Jane Austen fans, and that means they've seen the television and they've seen the film. But they do find reading her extraordinarily elegant but formal prose sometimes quite beyond them.
Do you actually like her writing, or do you like her as a woman? What parts of her
everything.
You like everything?
Everything. No, I started this project. It was called the Austen Project, and it was the idea, the brainchild of a young editor called Louisa Joyner at HarperCollins, and she was going to get 6 well-known writers to bring Jane Austen's 6 great novels up to date. And she asked if I would start. And she really said I could choose whichever one I liked. And they were rather hoping, I think, that I would choose Sense and Sensibility, which was a no-brainer, really, because it was the first one that Jane wrote herself. And it took her 16 years. She first had an epistolary novel called Eleanor and Marianne, which she read as a Christmas entertainment for her family. And I think they all said, you know, lovely, darling, in that slightly dismissive way of families. And it wasn't until 16 years later, when she was a very different kind of thinker as well as writer, the great cult of sensibility, which was an ecstatic response to nature and to emotions, that's Marianne, had been overtaken by an admiration for reason, and that was Eleanor. And Jane had herself gone in those 16 years from being Marianne to being Eleanor. And I started this project thinking I was an enormous fan of Jane Austen, and I ended it thinking she was a complete and utter genius. I think she's astonishing.
You said that Sense and Sensibility was the first published novel, and she had been writing those since she was very, very young indeed. She'd written all her life, really.
Yes.
So the fact that it was the first published novel is also due to the publishing environment of that period, which was more or less non-existent, particularly for women.
Well, almost unheard of for women. I mean, the Brontes had to pretend to be men. George Eliot, of course, was really called Mary Ann Evans. I mean, you all know that. But it was very, very hostile.
So Sense and Sensibility arose out of this novel of letters.
Yes.
And Jane herself did write lots and lots of letters, but many of them were destroyed.
Well, she asked her sister Cassandra, to whom most of them were addressed, that if she would burn them after her death. And I'm afraid Cassandra was a horribly good sister and did exactly what she was asked. Some do survive in this wonderful collection. It's the best collection of her letters, edited by Deirdre de la Fay. And they are extraordinary. And they reveal a woman, she was only 41 when she died, but they reveal a woman who was absolutely fascinated by other people, by clothes, by food, by household management, by social life, by other people. They dodge about all over the place. These are long letters which she would have written, you know, crossing them. So because paper was so scarce, she would have written across the page and then down the page. And they dodge about all over the place. They're as if she was talking to Cassandra, I think.
And what we're going to do is actually, we've got some wonderful images for you of the costumes, but also of Jane and so on. We're going to talk you through some of those with the letters as well. But before we do that, we just want to sort of talk a little bit more about the period as well. And also, I'd like to know, before anything, what do you feel about clothes and fashion and so on? How have you grown up with them? Were you always interested in clothes?
Well, like a lot of people here, do you remember after the war, there were no clothes, there was nothing. So I grew up making everything myself. My mother did, my grandmother did. I remember making a car coat once for my then husband. I mean, I look back and I think, what was I doing? But of course, there wasn't the proliferation of shops. There wasn't the availability of cheap, fast fashion.
You were born during the war.
I was born at the very end of 1943, sort of long pause so you can work out how old I am.
Hear all the cogwheels turning.
Exactly. So it was quite austere.
But do you remember sort of wanting at a certain point thinking, okay, now I can just do whatever, I can buy everything, I don't have to make things anymore?
No, not till I was probably I didn't start buying clothes properly until I was probably in my 30s. I made everything for my two daughters who are now in their 40s. Because I think one just did. And rafts of simplicity and vogue patterns. Do you remember those? Crawling about on the floor with one's mouth full of pins.
But I miss all those patterns too.
mended everything. I mean, we are a generation who can darn, who can replace buttons. We never throw anything away. I mean, my daughters often say they're going to put Mistress of the Leftover on my tombstone because I can't throw food away either. It has to be used.
Now, Jane Austen herself was
Very similar.
I mean, this is all so useful. I can't tell you how happy I am. But it is interesting. But like you as well, she didn't dwell enormously on clothing in her novels. And they're just there, if at all. She doesn't go into great detail of dress.
She doesn't actually, Rosie, go into much detail about anything. I mean, we know Pemberley is extraordinary and enormous, but she doesn't describe Pemberley. She doesn't describe people's houses. She doesn't describe their clothes. If she does, it's for satiric purpose.
Why do you think that is? If clothing and all this minutiae of daily life was so important to her, money in daily life, I mean, she wrote thousands of letters to her own sister, who was obviously in the next room.
About the nuts and bolts of life.
About the nuts and bolts of life, and she didn't describe this in her novels.
One of the miracles about her, I think, is that she was there were 7 or 8 of the Austens, I think. She grew up in the parish of Steventon, which is west of Basingstoke, between Basingstoke and Whitchurch in Hampshire.
So she was born in 1775.
Yes.
As all the Janeites.
She was. So the Napoleonic Wars obviously dominated. There were 2 things that dominated life enormously for Jane Austen. I think this had an effect on everything. One was the Napoleonic Wars. The second thing was that the great commodity of that period was sugar. And sugar, of course, was not a million miles from the slave trade. The Austens were all abolitionists. But the reason why Mr. Bingley has absolutely nothing to do is because he is actually, like a Trustafarian, he's a young man whose lifestyle is provided for most lavishly by sugar. It's not mentioned. And why, Mr. Bingley is 22, 23, Mr. Darcy the same age. What built Pemberley? Well, I think probably Pemberley was built on the produce of the coal mines of Derbyshire. What were the lives of 18th century miners like? I mean, the thing about Jane Austen, it is so wrong to think of it being a sort of sprig muslin quality street romance. They're not. They're really quite muscular. Mm-hmm. And there are dark shadows in all of them.
Now, the period you're describing is, you say, it's overshadowed by the Napoleonic Wars.
Very much so.
And the period in this country it's called the Regency era,
yes.
Georgian period. And she spent a long, long time in Bath as well. And she is called Bath's most famous citizen, I think, or writer. Every single place she's lived in, of course, she's revered. But she was exposed to high society, to
very much
fashion.
So. Mm.
She had lots of friends. She went out dancing and so on too. So
Bath was very smart.
And Bath was very, very smart indeed in that period. So it is interesting, again, that there's so little attention paid to fashion and clothing.
Well, it's very interesting. She uses clothes in books. If she describes anybody's clothes, it's rather like describing the kind of vehicle they drive. You remember in Northanger Abbey, you remember John Thorpe, who frightens Catherine hugely. He's got, I think, a curricle, which would have been, the equivalent of a rather flashy sports car now, the kind, you can see Arab boys driving up and down Knightsbridge. Whereas, somebody more sober would have a barouche. And she only uses clothes in exactly the same way as to indicate whether somebody is of moral or ethical worth or not. So the women in her novels, if you think about it, and I'm sure all of you will know them even better than I do, if she wants to commend somebody and she thinks somebody is of stature, a woman, she describes her as elegant. Do you remember Jane Fairfax in Emma is described as elegant? Emma has great aspirations to elegance. The Bennet girls, except for the mud round Lizzie's hem, are not really mentioned, their clothes. So if somebody their clothes are described, it is for a purpose. I mean, in Pride and Prejudice, if you remember, Lydia and Kitty constantly want to go shopping in Meryton. There were no shops. You have to remember that Jane Austen lived in a period where there were virtually no shops. There were some, but not this sort of proliferation that we have now.
And the clothes would come from, I mean, there was silk and there was cotton. It was the beginning of
there was a lot of cotton from India, from the East.
And of course, it was the East India trading.
And it was beginning to be processed in this country. And the East provided shawls. They were incredibly important. And I mean, as we'll see from the slides, their clothes are really quite flimsy when you think those are unheated houses.
And just such a leap from the period before where you had these sort of big panniered dresses, like bicycle panniers on either side of each gown. It was such an interesting
we need
contrast.
a fashion historian to explain why we suddenly went from these exaggerated clothes of the 17th century to...
Well, maybe Napoleon and his Josephine had something to do with it. I mean, neither you nor I are wearing an Empire line dress, because actually it's the most awful fashion I've...
It is.
Do any of you possess that? So it's below the bodice, below the breast kind of...
Well, they were fashionable. Do you remember, those of you of my age group, do you remember when the high waists in maybe the 1960s, the late 1960s and 70s? And we all had evening dresses with... And they weren't madly becoming. I mean, they were all right when you were young and fairly slender.
Well, they draw attention to that bit and that bit. Which,
and as you were saying, in Jane Austen's period, older women would have worn them as well as younger women.
Indeed.
So when they got quite
all
substantial...
ages wearing it's a fascinating period of history, it really is. But there were some very flamboyant bits and pieces, as we'll see as well. And some of these images, by the way, come from the V&A's own collection. So do go and look at the wonderful fashion collection here at the V&A. And some we have
beautifully curated too. I was amazed at the standard, the quality of them.
Wonderful.
And how beautifully they've been looked after.
So we're going to find a few images now. That's the lovely Joanna, and that is your friend Jane.
That's Jane. Nobody, you know, there's no real portrait of Jane, none that we can be quite certain of. But that might have been something regarded. I think that's a morning dress. I think we've got a ball dress somewhere, haven't we?
Yes, we can.
Can we find the
Do you
ball
want
dress?
to find the ball dress? What's interesting about that, again, it's all pastels, pale colours, and a little mob cap like that. That's Jane's writing.
Look how neat her writing was. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And that's how the novels were written. On a table smaller than this round table here. Have any of you been to Chawton? Yes. Isn't it absolutely fascinating? That tiny, tiny desk she wrote on.
And interestingly, if we were able to see the full picture here, we'd see that she'd actually written on all along the top and the edges as well. So she really did make the most of every little bit of paper there.
This is a letter to Cassandra. Cassandra was away staying with, they had various cousins, and Cassandra was constantly going off to assist with the birth of one baby or another around the family. And Jane, I think, was very thankful not to be married, because marriage meant immediately, it meant childbirth and the very real possibility you would die in childbirth. And she interestingly refers to both Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility as my darling child. So I think when she had finally turned down Harry Bigwither, I think she was probably quite relieved. But this is her writing to Cassandra. She's at home in Steventon. And Cassandra is away looking after yet another baby being born and its mother. And she's describing to Cassandra what she's going to wear for the ball at Kempshott that evening. So that's between Basingstoke and Whitchurch in Hampshire. And she says, I am not to wear my white satin cap tonight after all. I'm to wear a Marmaluke cap, and nobody can quite discover what a Marmaluke cap is, instead, which Charles Fowle sent to Mary and which she lends me. It is all the fashion now. Worn at the opera and by Lady Mildmays at the Hackwood balls. That was the huge local balls. I hate describing such things, and I dare say you'll be able to guess what it's like. I've got over the dreadful epoch of mantua making. I wonder if she was trying to do that at home, much better than I expected. My gown is made very much like my blue one, which you always told me sat very well, with only these variations, in that the sleeves are short, the wrap is fuller, the apron comes over it, and a band of the same completes the whole. So she was giving Cassandra quite a strong picture. And then there's the business of, because you change clothes all day long. So this is a bit later. This is about 2 years later. She's still at home writing to Cassandra. And she says to Cassandra, I shall want 2 new coloured gowns for the summer, for my pink one will not do more than clear me from Steventon. That's home. So I imagine working in the dairy, because a lot of women then would have worked a great deal of domestic work in the mornings. I shall not trouble you, however, to get more than one of them, and that is to be a plain brown cambric muslin for morning wear. The other, which is to be a very pretty yellow and white cloud, I mean to buy in Bath. That would have been quite exciting. Buy 2 brown ones, if you please, and both of a length, but one longer than the other. It is for me, and I am a tall woman. 7 yards for my mother, 7 yards and a half for me, a dark brown, but the kind of brown is left to your own choice, and I had rather they were different, as it will always be something to say, to dispute about which is the prettiest. They must be cambric muslin. It's fascinating. So, perhaps there was a dressmaker.
Well, that was the mantua
in Overton
maker,
or something. It might have been the mantua maker.
The mantua maker was a dressmaker, wasn't it?
Yes.
Somebody who'd come to your home and make clothes for you.
Exactly.
And that was a way for women who weren't able to earn money in any other way, a way for them to make some money.
Well, she was very, very interested in money. And she was just on the cusp of really making some money when she died. Mm. She would have loved it because it would have been so rare to have been independent. And her brother Henry was doing a lot of the publishing for her. And I think he was pretty incompetent. I think it drove her mad.
This is the picture of the back of the police. But
fantastic, isn't it?
Do you know what a... Should we just quickly describe what a police is?
Yes.
The police is P-E-L-I-S-S-E, which you probably know, is the overcoat, the outerwear that you'd wear over your silk or your cotton dresses. And they were quite often made of silk, or they were made of cotton. They were often lined. They usually had a very high collar, and very often pleated, brought in at the back there, a high waist again, and big sleeves tapering at the wrist as well. And they were wonderful, but they were probably the most flamboyant part of the dress, along with the headdresses and so on as well. But Jane Austen had one very famous pelisse. It was made of a kind of brown chestnut silk. It was absolutely beautiful. Because there are very few photographs, even of her clothes.
Yes.
There is this one, but it's very grainy, and it belongs to Hampshire County Council, so we couldn't get it. So you've got this one instead. But this is a beautiful, beautiful example of a pelisse.
And worn, she'd have to wear it with pattens to keep her out of the mud, wouldn't she? Because mud was everywhere.
And of course, there was no dry cleaning.
No.
Remember,
none.
So poor people had to sort of
There's a wonderful
wash
book
them.
by Joe Baker called Longbourn, and it's about what Pride and Prejudice was like from the servants' hall, and it's terribly well written, but it starts with somebody trying to clean Lizzie's boots, which I think would have been a miserable business.
Well, if you got too much mud on the silk garments, there was no way you could rescue them. You had to get rid of them.
Yes,
and
you
if
did.
you tried to dye them, which was another whole issue, because quite often people would try to dye their clothes just to change them a little bit, then they could be ruined by the dye. So it was very precarious.
Well, I think you had very few garments and you wore them endlessly, didn't you? Now, this extract about the police, it's written from Sloane Street. So she's staying with her brother Henry, so obviously on business of some kind in London. And it's 1811, so at this is about the time Pride and Prejudice was published. So we're almost up to speed. And she's obviously, being in London, she's been shopping. Writing again to Cassandra. I was very well satisfied with my purchases. My bugle trimming, that's the edges, it'd be bead trimming, wouldn't it, bugle trimming, at 2 and 4pence, and 3 pairs of silk stockings for little less than 12 shillings a pair. In my way back, who should I meet but Mr. Moore, just come from Beckenham. I believe he would have passed me if I had not made him stop, but we were delighted to meet. And I soon found, however, he had nothing new to tell me, and then I let him go. This is so Jane. Boring. Miss Burton has made me a very pretty little bonnet. And now nothing can satisfy me, but I must have a straw hat of the riding hat shape, like Mrs. Tilson's, or a young woman in this neighbourhood is actually making me one. I am really very shocking, but it will not be dear at a guinea. Our pelisses are 17 shillings each. Something of that complication made for 17 shillings. She charges only 8 shillings for the making, but the buttons seem expensive. I have to say, they are expensive. So the buttons would have been on the sleeves?
On the
yes,
sleeves, you can
see on the right-hand sleeve.
You can see the faint image of buttons. I'm sure there'll be other pictures. Well, we can
I think we ought to say something about the fact that their heads were always covered.
Well, the heads were covered, but you mentioned the straw hats there, or the hats. And of course, the hat then became the bonnet. Instead of having it like that, it was like that, to frame the face. But again, it's an interesting change from the previous period as well. I mean, why did women always have to cover their heads, do you think?
Well, you'd had wigs, hadn't you, before? So this was natural hair, at least. It was all obviously much more fluid, and I think it was erotic too, wasn't it?
Well, this idea of framing the face was definitely, but some of the mob caps you see in the older women, because they were obviously meant to satirise a particular type of woman as well in Jane Austen. Now this is interesting here because this is a rather fetching hat, and the shawl, the matching shawl as well. So you'd have these quite simple garments of cotton mostly, muslin or lawn, and then you'd have a rather lovely shawl, quite often sort of Indian style, Indian embroidery as well, and then a rather fun hat, and quite often you'd have plumes and feathers coming out of them. And gloves, yes, droopy gloves. Everything was droopy and soft and feminine.
No, it's quite interesting. There's a bit here about caps, because of course you'd have worn a cap indoors.
Another one we have of a cap.
Miss Hare had some pretty caps. Where have we got to now? We've got to 1813, so...
There's a nice cap for you.
She's, so 1813, she'd have been about 4 books down, wouldn't she, by then?
Well, so there were 4 books, there were 6 books published, and 4 in her lifetime. So not that many by 1813.
No, that's right.
So Sense and Sensibility,
but
Pride
there was
and
beginning to be a little bit more money, which she was very, very enthusiastic about. She says, Miss Hare had some pretty caps, and is to make me one, like one of them, only white satin instead of blue. So very like this. It will be white satin and lace, and a little white flower perking out of the left ear, like Harriet Byron's feather. I have allowed her to go as far as £1 and 16 shillings. My gown is to be trimmed everywhere with white ribbon plaited on somehow or other. She says it will look well. I am not sanguine.
She's quite a forceful character.
She
in
is.
these
Oh,
letters,
she
isn't
was not a word mincer in any ways whatsoever. I discovered, when I was writing Sense and Sensibility, there are only 2 characters in the entire novel that she doesn't tease. I mean, I stuck like paint to her characters and her narrative.
You were very, very faithful in your rewriting.
Well, it was, apart from giving people jobs, it was really no problem at all, because every character type translates absolutely seamlessly to the present day. But I discovered, too, that there are only 2 people in the entire novel that she doesn't tease. She doesn't tease Colonel Brandon, and she doesn't tease Eleanor Dashwood. Everybody else is up for grabs. There's even a wonderful moment when, you remember the famous scene where Willoughby dumps Marianne in public, and much wailing. And Marianne, that's about under a third of the way through the book. So Marianne has the vapors then for the rest of the book. And in the scene after he's been so outrageous to her in public, she goes home and says no, she doesn't want to see anybody, and she bolts her bedroom door and she says she's never going to sleep. And then the next chapter starts. Jane Austen says, Marianne woke the next morning having slept much better than she had expected.
Well, you did actually bring that that particular scene rather up to date.
Well, it was rather a pleasure to do because of this modern sense of emotional entitlement. It translated very nicely.
I did like the way, though, you called Willoughby Wills, and
yes,
rather nice. But you made Mrs. Dashwood, I thought was quite interesting. I could easily picture her, Belle Dashwood, because you actually made her a bit more interesting than she is in Jane Austen. So,
well, she doesn't have a Christian name.
No.
She doesn't have a first name.
She's very arty. Well, she's a painter, isn't she?
Well, she's right. Yes, I've made her into a kind of superannuated hippie. But in the book, she's a bit vacuous and a bit emotional. And she's very caught up in Marianne's passion for Willoughby.
But what you do, you describe dress and clothing more in your version of Sense and Sensibility than Jane does, because you have Sir John Middleton.
Yes,
is actually, he runs a clothing business.
Well,
a quality clothing business from home, mail order.
I had Johnny Bowden in mind when I was writing to John Middleton. I just thought one of those rather hearty, classy, old Etonian clothes manufacturers.
And you had the girls were wearing jeans and
yes,
sloppy jumpers and had iPods.
But you see, I think if Jane had been able to shop as we are able to shop, I think clothes would have featured far more. Jane was, because it was the vogue of her time, Jane was absolutely obsessed with the propriety of character and the dignity, the cultivation, the integrity of people mattered hugely. And because we are much more morally ambivalent, because we're so determined to be inclusive, Jane wasn't in the least interested in being inclusive. I mean, we might have made fun of Mrs. Elton, but we would have tried to find something good to say about her, because in our sort of politically correct way, we are not so dismissive. And she's really quite ruthless about the people who are beyond the pale. And Mrs. Elton, when it comes to clothes, there's just tiny hints that Mrs. Elton's clothes are overdone, in the modern term blingy, a bit vulgar, a bit too much of everything. And she's given things to say. She's describing somebody's wedding. And she says, it was so disappointing. There was so little white satin. And that's meant to indicate what an idiot she is. Mm-hmm. And how she is, because her brother, if you remember, her brother-in-law is a very successful slave trader near Bristol. My bro-in-law at Maple Grove. So Jane is taking every tiny opportunity she has through clothes, through all kinds of other things, just to make sure that we know Mrs. Elton is a vulgarian.
I like Mrs. Elton. Now it's... I think I know why I like Mrs. Elton so much.
Because all this will have been... I mean, I suppose everything will have been hand done, won't it?
Everything hand done. Now, that is also a banknote, possible banknote picture,
Yes, it
we
is.
hope. Which I really do like that so much. And I think the blue, because of course white was the preferred colour. Everybody wanted white dresses. Perfectly impractical. But this blue is gorgeous. And short sleeves.
Yes.
Very interesting, again, short sleeves. Whereas as you grew older, you had longer sleeves. And Jane, when she was very ill, she was dying, as we think might have been Addison's disease. She died at the age of 41, and she spent a lot of time in bed and so on. She was covered with
She was
shawls
on a row of upright dining room chairs in the sitting room of the house, while her mother, who was the last word in hypochondria, had the sofa. Jane, who was really dying, lay on a row of upright chairs.
Goodness. I didn't realise that. I really didn't. Of course,
Not very keen on Mrs. Austen. I don't think Jane was, no.
No, which is why some of those women in those books the mothers particularly, don't come off very well, do they? Right, so that's the lovely writing, which you can actually read.
And when you think that's all done, not just with a quill pen, but something that had to be dipped, because it's extraordinarily even. She wouldn't have had to make ink. That would have been around by then. But it's phenomenal, isn't it?
But the novel itself hadn't been around very long, and that is also fascinating.
It's as if, when Jane wrote Sense and Sensibility, it's as if I was writing in a genre which had only been really established about 1990. It's phenomenal that she just took to it like a duck to water.
But 25 years, I think they reckoned, she was the first person after Henry Fielding, Samuel Richardson,
she was.
The first woman.
She was.
To write and to publish. And that we've talked about. This is another...
I think that's charming.
That is charming. Absolutely unwearable, I would have thought.
Did you say this is called a Spencer?
This is called a Spencer.
This little crop jacket.
And this one's made of velvet, you can see, and it's quite flamboyant in the way that the sleeve head has got a lot of gathering at the top there. But it was named after one of the early earls, Spencer. And because he had, in a rather extraordinary moment, he said, I can design a fashion. So all he did was chop off his coattails. And so men and women wore this, and it was just fashionable. I don't think it was very practical at all. But it looks rather nice. And you can see the curly hair as well. Curls were in. You had to always have curly hair. If you didn't have a hat, or if you did have a hat and there were any hairs showing, it had to be curled. Everything had to be curled.
Well, those are quite lavishly proportioned women, aren't they?
They are. It's back to this particular fashion of the Empire line, where everything, you had to wear stays and some kind, everything was shoved up. All these two were shoved up as high and as tightly as they could go, which is why you always see a little bit of bosom over the top. And the necklines were either V necklines or rectangular, so something would always be showing. Now, we can't quite work out what this is. This might be a revival of some kind, but I don't know.
I'm fascinated by the fabric, because that looks to me like an organdy. It's quite gauzy, isn't it?
Yes,
and
it is.
We've got a shot of the back, I think, too.
We have.
Lovely
very
thing.
Simple. Very, very lovely. And again, these gatherings at the back, whereas before you'd have a big poof at the back of your dress. That lovely detail.
And that fabric would have been made by hand.
Everything. Absolutely everything.
It's phenomenal, isn't it?
Now, these dresses are
That's
quite
very
long.
Empire,
very
isn't it?
Empire, and quite long. And you can see the bandeaus and the hair and the makeup as well. You'd be using rouge on your lips as well. The necklaces, quite a lot of jewellery being worn as well. And the gloves again. Now this, if you've ever seen the 1995 film Sense and Sensibility, that was I think Gwyneth Paltrow and Kate Winslet and various. This is the kind of dress that the good girls would always wear, because they were meant to be very free, and they'd have a little shawl over them and maybe a little bonnet or something. But if you think how extremely simple that is.
But you know, it's still trimmed, isn't it? You see, when she was talking about in the extract I read about having bought the bugle beads, there's a quite a complicated braid which would also have been handmade around the sleeves and around the hem.
How do you think the
I wonder if that fabric was Indian, though.
I should imagine it was, because most of the cotton, of course, was coming from India.
Yes,
but
very much so.
so simple. Drawstring.
And of course, no sewing machines to make it, so that would all have been hand-stitched.
Now, Jane herself did sew.
She did.
Didn't she?
Well, everybody sewed, because you made children's clothes, didn't you? You made things eternally.
And you're constantly darning as well. Now, this is an example, again, this would be an Indian cotton of some kind embroidered. Absolutely beautiful. The dresses did get shorter and shorter because it was just more practical, of course,
Yes.
if you're walking through the mud.
Yes.
And sometimes you just chop off the bottom of your dress anyway. That's something that we want to get on and talk about, is the influence that this design still has today.
Very, very much so. And of course, you could dress yourself now, couldn't you? Because later on, you know, if you think of Downton Abbey, by the time you got on to mid-Victorian, late Victorian Edwardian clothes, it was very difficult to get into them on your own.
But yes, no, all
and being
this.
laced up the back and this kind
again,
of thing.
these are dresses that were worn by the middle classes and the upper middle classes to a certain degree, but also by, you know, simple working women as well. Not this particular one, but there'd be a simple chemise. But I was looking through a fashion magazine, as I often do, this week, and I saw a dress that could have been out of a Jane Austen novel. Because there is, at the moment, a revival of the so-called boho 60s kind of dress, because it'll be constantly coming back, won't it?
Well, I think, you know, that as I often feel about themes in fiction, as I was saying to you earlier, there's nothing about the human condition that Shakespeare or Sophocles hasn't thought of already. But our job as modern novelists is to reinterpret these old truths about the human condition for our own times. And I suppose the same is true for clothes, for painting, for all kinds of styles, that, you know, that will inspire something. Well, the Alexander McQueen show here was an example of taking various things from history and putting them through the filter of 2005 or whatever it was, for a modern interpretation. So even if this is all very influenced, and you know, Laura Ashley indeed was very influenced by this, it's got a modern twist, hasn't it? There's been a contemporary difference to bring it up to the way people live now, which is very different. Of course, women were going to get much more immobile than this. I mean,
This is an extraordinary
these
period,
women
wasn't
moved
it?
about and walked and were
It's
quite
like a
busy.
glitch, wasn't it? It's like a glitch in fashion history, this
But
moment.
the Victorians put women back into the doll's house. You know, a woman was much easier to control if she'd been infantilized. So she became, you know, as Florence Nightingale said, a kind of wind-up toy in the drawing room. You know, and you waited for a man to come in and turn the key. And then you did your little song and dance bit, and then he went out, and you waited for somebody else to come and do the same for you.
That's
I mean,
all
the boredom.
changed now.
Yes,
It's all changed.
yes. No, there is no excuse for boredom now.
No. But yes, I mean, and I just want to quickly whiz through these and make sure we've seen them all, because there is one thing. Of course, if you were a girl in 1810, you would have probably 3 or 4 dresses.
Yes.
You would have maybe a couple of pair of shoes. They'd all be flat because they believed in comfort.
No, the shoes are really extraordinary.
Now, where are we?
The shoes are amazingly modern. Look, isn't that a desirable little bit of footwear?
And very flat. Now, one
They're
thing,
lovely, aren't they?
They're lovely. Ballet pumps.
Yeah.
There you are today, but not very good for your arches. But the interesting thing about that period again, which again is such a unique period of history, fashion history, is that, of course, everybody danced. Jane loved dancing too,
Yes,
didn't she?
they all danced.
They all danced,
And
so
of
they
course,
had to have comfortable
But
shoes.
you didn't dance in pairs. I mean, you danced in pairs, but you weren't held by your partner.
No.
So the fact that you were possibly uncorseted would
Yes.
not have been.
So you could wear quite a flimsy dress, which of course,
Exactly.
if you see in all the adaptations, they are quite flimsy.
You danced holding somebody's hand, but in a pattern.
But these, as you can see, this is an indication of how popular just movement was, being comfortable. Again, a very interesting aspect of this time. And because Jane loved dancing, she's always describing the balls and the various social gatherings. And quite often you'd be dancing after dinner too, wouldn't you?
Yes, you did, and you walked. I mean, everybody in her novels walks, don't they? And, the two silly sisters, the two silly Bennet sisters, are always going into Meryton. And you did walk.
So I think I want to get on to one thought, which I think you will also. Now.
Oh, him.
And this is a special, okay, it's my little weakness, but your special treat.
He was absolutely gorgeous, wasn't he?
He was.
Yes, he was.
He is.
Yes, he is.
He is, even in his funny Christmas sweaters in Bridget Jones's Diary. But there is a reason to this, which is obviously the male dress very, very different, but also very
wonderful
comfortable.
Clothes for men.
Very, very, very wonderful clothes. And they also wore the pelisse, the overcoat, and these cravats as well, the high necks. This brings us up to this idea of adaptations and modernisation of Jane Austen. There isn't a novelist I can think of who's been, if you like, sort of taken to heart and imitated and impersonated and copied as much as Jane Austen. I mean, there are Janeites, but there are no sort of.
If you go on, you go online. I think in the last 5 years there've been over 2,000 Jane Austen-inspired books of one kind or another. People cannot leave her alone.
And why is that?
I think it is partly because of her profound understanding about the three main strands of fiction: romantic love, money, and class. I think she understood that. I think she has also, the films and television has done an enormous amount. And I think there is a great misunderstanding, unfortunately, a modern misunderstanding, of her being, they are all love stories with happy endings. Well, they're successful conclusions at the end of her books because marriage was a career for a gently born woman. I mean, it was almost impossible for Jane to earn a living.
Because how else would you earn a living?
How else would you earn a living? And you didn't want to be a governess because then you were you belonged to no class and were treated disgracefully, as Jane Eyre demonstrates. But I think there's been a misunderstanding. There's been, I do honestly think the cinemas had an enormous amount to do with it.
I mean, there was a massive revival of Jane Austen through the films and the TV series, and you had that famous Sense and Sensibility film, by
Emma Thompson.
Emma Thompson.
Yes, wonderful film.
Wonderful film. That was
Yes.
1995. Then you had Pride and Prejudice, which is why he's there, in 1995 as well.
That was television, wasn't
and that
it?
was television. What do you
And
think
of course,
all
the
those
scene that
films
he's so famous for is not in the novel. Andrew Davis wrote it into the television adaptation.
Well, I'm sure that you sympathise with Andrew Davis to a certain degree.
Oh, I
because
think he's done an
updates-
extraordinary job, yes.
And think what he did with War and Peace, which is quite wonderful, I think.
But I think also he is quite right to point out that everybody in these novels is incredibly young. I mean, a lot of these girls would have been dead before they were 30, and a lot of them would have died in childbirth.
The girls in Sense and Sensibility, they're all teenagers, so they are very young indeed.
They're very young.
Jane was 41 when she died. He was, as you say, I think 22.
I think he would have been in his early 20s, Mr. Darcy, and Georgiana, his sister, would have been about 14 or 15.
Do you like these adaptations? Do you think that Jane can be done to death? I mean,
Not really, because nobody, I mean, I do think Emma Thompson got as close as is possible to get, because she was so very, very acute about the emotional suffering of Eleanor Dashwood. Because when I came to look at Sense and Sensibility, it's perfectly plain to me that, what's he called? Who's the man Eleanor's in love with?
Willoughby.
No, who Hugh Grant plays in the movie. Edward
yes.
Ferrars, thank you so much. I think he's a depressive, without any question, and bullied by his family. And of course, that's a very modern interpretation to be able to put on it. And I think each age, because she is so remarkably astute about the human condition, and it doesn't matter when that happens, human beings, however differently we dress, eat food, conduct ourselves towards each other, whatever happens, we go on longing for and dreading the same things. And she understood that completely. So I think she is completely adaptable for any age, and people can keep picking her up and having another look. I'm personally rather opposed to the tremendous sentimentality about Jane Austen. They are not just love stories. You know, marriage was a serious career choice then, and you had to marry well. And money was of consequent importance. It was unbelievably important, because if you fell from prosperity in Jane Austen's day, you didn't fall to poverty, you fell to utter destitution. You had nothing to eat, you were in rags in the gutter. And so you married well often because that saved you from this appalling fate. You didn't marry for romantic love. Romantic love was much later. But it was wonderful if you could marry somebody who was going to be the most marvelous companion to you.
And that was rare indeed.
That was quite rare. But what is very interesting, if you notice at the end of all her novels, she loses interest in them. The minute she's done the chase, when it gets to everybody's weddings, she kind of turns her back. Just look at the last page of all your Jane Austens when you get home, and you'll see her saying, well, I expect they were okay, not really interested.
Which is why it's interesting when P.D. James wrote that Return to Pemberley, which was on television a year or two ago. And I think it worked very well, actually, because she was trying to imagine what happened after they got married. Now, as a very special treat at the end, we'll have a few questions in a minute as well. Joanna's going to read from her new novel, and which is coming out next year.
It'll be out in about a year.
Be out in about a year, but it also does mention...
Well, they always mention clothes. Because I use clothes in fiction to indicate personality, state of mind, social class, or to indicate that you're coming up against a person of a particular kind. I mean, I remember when I wrote The Rector's Wife, quite early on in the beginning, the heroine, Anna Bouverie, is wearing a huge skirt made out of some curtains that a parishioner has given her to use somewhere in the rectory because she has none. And she's made this enormous dramatic skirt out of it. And her frugality, her inventiveness, her mother's an actress, slight theatricality, you get a lot out of the fact that you know she's made her own skirt this way. At the beginning of Daughters-in-Law, the favourite daughter-in-law is an art student and aggressively bohemian in her appearance, so you kind of know where you are. But sometimes clothes are very useful to indicate a state of mind. And in the novel that will be out next, it's called City of Friends, and it's about 4 women in the finance industry. It's about 4 women who are friends who, I did all the research for this novel in Canary Wharf. So they're women in banking of one kind or another. They're all in their late 40s. And the novel starts with one of them she's called Stacy, losing her job. And this is absolute agony for her. She's always worked. She's married, got a beloved dog. She's got an ailing mother who has dementia. But she has never had children. And this is the effect when she has to dress up to go and meet one of the other, her 3 great friends. She has to go up dressed to go and meet her in the city. This is her trying to find something to wear. She's been in jeans and an old jersey of her husband's at home in this very demoralized state. And this is an indication of how I would use clothes. It's not that differently from Jane Austen in a way, but this is to indicate a state of mind. She had lost weight or something dramatically. She'd never been exactly thin, but her clothes and her body in the past, and at least looked as if they belonged together. She'd never been a beauty, after all, and had once caught sight of a work assessment that described her as pleasant looking. But she had definitely and successfully once made the most of what there was. But now, standing in front of the long mirror in her bedroom, in her favourite suit, work suit, black and white flecked tweed with a black leather piping, the sight was appalling. The skirt hung limply on her as if it couldn't be bothered to try and accommodate itself to someone of so irrelevant a size. And the jacket stood away from her neck and shoulders, gaping and alien. She slid her hand inside her waistband. It was loose, but not that loose. Had her hips and thighs shrunk? What had happened? She didn't feel thinner, after all. She just felt lumpy and bloated, saturated with all the wrong things, misery especially. She threw the suit jacket on the bed and stepped out of the skirt. Standing there in her underwear and a silk camisole from her previous life, with bare feet and unbrushed hair, she regarded herself in the mirror with something both close to both revulsion and despair. She picked up the jacket and skirt and put them on the hanger. And she then unhooked a sweater dress from the rail in her wardrobe, navy blue, round-necked, knee-length, always before slightly on the tight side. Would that do? So that's using clothes as an indication of a kind of despair reflected in your body and how you feel in your clothes, but actually to do with what's going on inside your head. And that's where they are in fiction, as far as I'm concerned now, so incredibly useful.
Joanna Trollope immediately understood what I was trying to do with fashion and fiction, and I'm sure this hour has proven to all of you that we were absolutely right. That was absolutely wonderful. A remarkable hour. Thank you so much, Joanna Trollope.
I've loved it, and thank you so much
Thank you
for
very,
coming.
very much.